Hello guys, Professor O'Brien here with a quick lecture on Rhetorical Grammar Chapter 5, Cohesion. This is a relatively short chapter. Most of the chapter is common sense. Let's look at the 5 points made on page 82 just as introduction, and then we'll ease our way into the chapter. We remember, and I keep asking you in class, define paragraph. And some of you are still a bit vague. I can see students' eyes wandering when I ask that question. It's basically just a group of sentences that, number one, cohere, that hang together. And secondly, a group of sentences that appear to be set apart from other groups of sentences in such a way, perhaps, that there's a progression of paragraphs through your essay, chapter, whatever it might be. So cohesion is all about examining connections between sentences, particularly as you think about reader expectation. Cohesion is about repeating key terms, and this is a term we have to be careful with, because we don't want to over-repeat or overuse repetition. The third term, this might be the most important of the three, the known new contract. Some of you may be aware of this. I mentioned it in class previously, but not in any great detail, whereby a sentence begins with information that we know already and goes on to add new information. That's the ideal sentences. Many sentences break this rule, of course, but the no new contract is an important feature of writing. Number 4, cohesion involves improving clarity by eliminating broad reference. This just means avoid using pronouns that don't specifically refer to something, to some previous antecedent. This is a major issue with student writing. It's a feature of lazy thinking and lazy writing. Usually what happens is the student is thinking of something, assumes their reader is thinking along the same lines, and they're wrong, and the reader picks up the wrong point. And the 5th point, cohesion involves creating parallel structures. So you're not necessarily repeating the same words, but you're repeating the same structures with different words in them. So those are the 5 points. Now, the first section of this chapter, beginning page 82, involves reader expectation. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time about this. When you buy a book in Barnes & Noble, you're buying it because you know the author's name, you like the cover, you read an extract, whatever it might be. You have expectations when you open that book. Now, sometimes it's fine to book expectations, to break the pattern and to do something new, but you need a very good reason to do that. Otherwise, as writers of anything, whether it be creative fiction or creative non-fiction, I implore you not to fiddle with your readers' expectations unless you have a very good reason to do this. Okay, now this brings us to paragraphs very neatly. I'm on page 83 of the text, and we are reminded, I'm sure your middle school teacher mentioned this, every paragraph opens with a topic sentence. Maybe. Many paragraphs break this rule, but let's accept this rule for the time being. And that topic sentence suggests the direction the paragraph will move. So the Lincoln and Douglas paragraph is an excellent example. On page 83, despite the immense racial gulf separating them, Lincoln and Douglas had a lot in common. What? This tall white guy with a stovepipe hat and a freed slave. Immediately, your interested because you want to find out what do these two possible guys have possibly have in common, and you read on. And we're expecting to read some facts that prove that bold point in the topic sentence. You can read the rest of the paragraph yourself, bottom of page 83. Now, as English majors, or I assume you're English majors, I expect you to be readers. And as readers, most of your reading is done subconsciously. You might not even be aware of it. When you read anything, you're so used to it because you've been doing it since age 4 or 5 that you're looking for patterns, not necessarily A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You don't see the letters anymore. You just see the patterns, and it gets automatically decoded by the reading circuitry in your brain. In the same way, many of the reactions you have to the material you read might be inexplicable at conscious level. It might be happening at subconscious level. You might not know why you're putting a book down, having read the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. But your subconscious knows. It says, I don't like this book. It's perfectly fine to put books down. I hated Moby Dick when I was an undergrad, and it was only years later I came back to it. There are certain books that work for certain people at certain times. However, that said, you're still expected to read. Expect that you have writers reading for you, and expect to react to texts as your writers expect you to react. Excuse me, I do not have the virus. I've just been lecturing non-stop for days, and my throat is killing me. This comes back to reader expectations. I'm 1/3 of the way down page 84 here. As a reader, you're going to fit the ideas of the current sentence into what you already know. This is going to connect up to the known new contract in a few minutes. If you're a bricklayer, you're going to expect another brick of the same sort when you're building a house. If somebody gives you a triangular brick rather than your average square brick or whatever it is you're using, you're not quite going to know what to do with it. Okay. I like the group discussion exercise on page 84. I particularly like question 2, and I'd recommend that you try that on your own. Now, we're on to the next section of the chapter, repetition, or lexical cohesion, as the chapter describes itself. And I quite like the text's quotation of George Dillon here, 2/3 of the way down page 85. As writers, you're constantly caught between the journalism professor saying never use the same word twice, and the English professor saying repeat key terms. This is a tension that can't easily be resolved. All I can tell you in the end is to use common sense. If you feel there's excessive repetition in your writing, there probably is. If you feel there isn't enough repetition in your writing, there probably is. And it's only through practice that you're going to find that sweet spot. You'll be wrong the first time. You'll be wrong the second time. Third, fourth, and fifth times, you might start improving. Just use common sense as writers. Okay. There isn't much else I want to say about that right now, except we are going to be talking about repetition in this chapter, and it's okay to repeat key terms. You just need to be careful with them. Note the journalistic style of the description of the baseball game, which is on page... can't find it anymore. I'll come back to this. I'll come back to this baseball game. There it is, bottom of page 85, earlier than I thought. This is a typical journalistic description of a baseball game, not a single repetition. Even though the actions are the same, different verbs are used every time to describe the actions. And the same with the nouns. Even though the people and the things around them are the same, different nouns are used all the time. This is typical journalism. Don't repeat terms. On the other hand, you will find in other material, I didn't think to mark anything here, you'll find a lot of repetition elsewhere. In fact, the more I think about it, there's a good section at the very end of this chapter. Yes, it's the paragraph beginning at the very bottom of page 97 and spilling over into page 98, where world economy, national economy are repeated. Words like country and business keep being repeated, but they're repeated very carefully, and it's a very artistic use of repetitions. Again, common sense. You remember in class that my textbook was falling apart. It's the only one of edition 7 that I have. So laugh if you wish. I'm going to be constantly trying to find pages as they fall out of my book and onto the ground. Okay, the third section of this chapter, the known new contract. This is really central to this whole chapter on cohesion. Now, all the known new contract really means is that a sentence should begin with material that's already known and move on to material that's new. I'll just jump to the bottom of page 87 here, and you'll see the sentence opening this paragraph on weather. Thunderstorms can be categorized as single cell or multi-cell. It's a perfect example. Everybody knows what a thunderstorm is. This is known information. On the other hand, I will bet 95% of the class don't know that thunderstorms can be categorized as single cell or multi-cell. So that's new information. This is an excellent example of the known new contract in a sentence. All right. Another excellent example, I'm just referring here to 3 paragraphs down page 87, is the Lincoln-Douglas paragraph on page 83. Despite the immense racial gulf separating them, Lincoln and Douglas had a lot in common. Now, okay, we'll talk about the adverbial beginning despite there in a few minutes. But Lincoln and Douglas, known information. Had a lot in common? Definitely not known information. Like I said, we'll talk about the opening adverbial in a few minutes. All right, let's carry on with the example paragraph I was talking about there, the thunderstorm paragraph at the bottom of page 87. And let's talk about the known new contract as it works its way through this paragraph. We'll see the second sentence here. Basically, a single cell thunderstorm is the lone thunderstorm that forms on a hot, humid day. Where did we get this single cell concept from? The new information of the previous sentence. So, in essence, you might have sentences that run A, B, B, C, C, D. You get the idea. B is the new information in the first sentence. But B is the known information in the second sentence, followed by the new information C, and then onwards you'll have CD, and so on. Now, the known new contract isn't a legal contract. You can break it. I always tell my students, break the rules, but know the rules first. You can only break a rule if you know what the rule is. Okay, so you have the single cell thunderstorm, harking back to the previous sentence. The lone thunderstorm that forms on a hot, humid day. That hot, humid day, kind of new information. And let's look at what happens in the next sentence. The heat and humidity of the day is the only trigger for the form. Now the heat and humidity is known information. The only trigger for the storm, new information. So you get the idea. Known, new, known, new, known, new. Like I say, you can break this rule as often as you like, but be aware. Know when you're breaking it. There's a nice example on page 88, at the top of page 88, from the famous writer Louise Erdrich. And you will see how a pronoun, it, is used in the second sentence to hark back to the new information of the first sentence. This desire to deepen my alternate language, Ojibwe, puts me in an odd relationship to my first love, English. It is, after all, the language stuffed into my mother's ancestors' mouths. That it, of course, refers to the new information of the previous sentence. And it's now known information in the second sentence. Now, this section of the chapter shifts a little bit on page 88. Moving on to paragraph structure. We're still talking about the known new contract. And you'll see what we're talking about if I read this paragraph aloud. Our trip to Florida for spring break turned out to be a disaster. The hotel room we rented was miserable, shabby and stuffy and downright depressing. The food we could afford made our dining hall remembrances from campus seem positively gourmet. The daily transportation to the beach we had been promised showed up only once, and even then it was an hour late. Okay. Now, what we have is a topic sentence which really asks for more information. If you were to say, our trip to Florida for spring break turned out to be a disaster, and never expanded it, that would enrage your reader. Your reader expects you to describe what went wrong in the spring break. And now, bear with me here while I talk about the word the. If I tell you the car's broken down, it's a car that you and I know about. The hotel room we rented was miserable. The food we could afford. Yes, this is all new information, but using the determiner the makes it feel like it's known information. Also, we know what a hotel room looks like. We know what food is. We know what daily transportation involves. So it's still kind of known information. What we don't know is how bad the hotel room was, how bad the food was, how bad the daily transportation was. So the follow-on information there is new information. This isn't quite the case, but you could almost imagine that this paragraph is of the form AB, BC, BD, BE. You have the idea. The sentences 2, 3, and 4 all begin with the known information B. I'm playing hard and fast with the truth here, but you have the idea. You start with an idea, and then you hold on to that idea once, twice, 3 times, expanding, adding new information each time. Okay. The group discussion passage from Stephen Ambrose's book, halfway down page 89, it's an excellent read. Have a read through that paragraph there and think about the information patterns, that is, the known new patterns, and cohesive ties. What sort of pronouns is he using? How is he making one sentence flow on to the next? Think about that. I think exercise 16 is excellent. It's something you should do at home. It's something I always do with my students in class when I'm teaching this in a classroom. What could you do to improve cohesion? Now, as it stands, this is an excellent passage in desperate need of improvement. The editors of this book have deliberately removed the cohesive information, particularly known new contract structure. Can you rebuild this? I'm sorry, all 5 of these paragraphs to make the known new contract stick. Try it. Okay, now I mentioned pronouns just about 2 minutes ago. I'm going to mention them again. A pronoun, by definition, has an antecedent. Professor O'Brien walked into the university lecture theatre. He was angry because the university had denied his application for a second laptop, whatever. The he there is the important bit. Its antecedent is Professor O'Brien in the previous sentence. Pronouns are an excellent cohesion tool, and they are underused by students, and often when they are used by students, they are misused by students. We will talk a little about this in a few moments. Personally, I kind of feel the he is overdone in the weasel paragraph, but I'm at the bottom of page 90 here, the weasel paragraph. A weasel is wild. Who knows what he thinks? He sleeps in his underground den, his tail draped over his nose. Sometimes he lives in his den for 2 days without leaving. Outside, he stalks rabbits, mice, muskrats, blah, blah, blah. You can see the pronoun is repeated again and again and again. And it's not just repeated as the plain pronoun he, it's also put into the possessive, his tail, his underground den, etc. Even when it's in the possessive and therefore behaving like a determiner, it is still a pronoun. It's still harking back to something earlier. It still needs an antecedent. Professor O'Brien walked angrily into the university lecture theatre. His car had been stolen again. His has to be referring back to Professor O'Brien in the first sentence. There's some fine examples of this in the Portland paragraphs halfway down page 91. Okay. Now, demonstrative pronouns. Be aware that there's a difference between a demonstrative pronoun where the word takes the place of an entire noun phrase. Professor O'Brien decided to hold the rest of his class online. That sounded like a good plan. That is clearly referring to the entire concept of the previous sentence there. Now, on the other hand, you can have phrases like, that car is a very nice car. Is that a demonstrative pronoun there? No, it is a demonstrative adjective. So, yes, be aware you can have a demonstrative pronoun standing on its own, or you can have a demonstrative adjective attached to a noun. Okay, so that's the difference between the two that's at the top of page 92. The important thing here, however, is that these are still pronouns or pronoun-y, and they are insisting that the reader think back to the previous sentence. Do you see the difference in the second sentence? I'm at the top of page 92 again, and the text points this out, between that plan sounds good to me and the plan sounds good to me. The plan sounds good to me sounds less definite. It feels less like there's an antecedent somewhere. That plan hammers home to us the fact that there's a plan in a previous sentence that's being referred to. So be aware, you can use demonstratives in many ways. They all have antecedents one way or another, and they're an excellent tool for cohesion. Okay. Now, I said that students, number one, should use pronouns more for cohesion, and two, frequently when they do, misuse them. Let's take a look at the paragraph just before the end of page 92 here. My roommate told me she has decided to drop out of school and look for a job. This has taken me completely by surprise, and I know it will shock her parents. Now, this is an easy enough paragraph to understand, but the point is that this is a broad reference. It's referring to everything in the previous sentence. In fact, it's referring to too much in the previous sentence. I would be inclined to do exactly what the text suggests, a quarter of the way down page 93. This decision of hers took me completely by surprise. Now, it isn't referring to this amorphous general concept presented by the first paragraph. It's referring specifically to the decision that the roommate made. Now, for practice, I'd recommend doing exercise 17 at the bottom of page 93. I think it's an excellent example of, it provides some excellently bad examples of broad reference that it suggests you repair. So have a try of changing the paragraphs 1 to 6 on the top of page 94 and see if you can remove the broad reference. Now, we're still nominally talking about the known new contract, and I want to talk about the role of the passive voice. You'll remember, and you'll see this in Microsoft Word every time you write it. Microsoft Word will put a little jagged line under your sentence and say, passive voice, consider revising. Now, that's fine, consider revising. Sometimes you will want to keep the passive voice. I personally get a bit tired of the passive voice warnings of Microsoft Word because as often as not, I have a good reason to use the passive voice. Unfortunately, you guys all too frequently use the passive voice because you think it sounds grand. A decision was made to submit the homework 2 hours late. Or a decision was made by me to submit the homework 2 hours late. Why don't you simply say, I decided to submit the homework 2 hours late, or whatever it is? It may sound a little grander, but it also disguises the doer of the action. And as often as not, you do not need to do that. Find some other way around it. But of course, this requires that you be able to identify the passive voice. So think about this, see how you can do it. It's always some form of the verb to be plus the past participle. Just remember that. Now, there's a good reason to use the past participle. I hope I've warned you off it while telling you you should be using it sometimes. And it should be used particularly if you're trying to keep the known new contract going. Let's look, well, it's a long paragraph, so I'll just look at the first two sentences provided in the paragraph at the bottom of page 94. If Americans are truly interested in saving the rainforests, they should move beyond rhetoric and suggest policies that are practical and acceptable to the understandably wary Brazilians. Such policies cannot be presented as take them or leave them propositions. Now there's your passive sentence, the second one there, the underlined one. Hopefully you'll understand that the writer there has used the passive voice to retain the known new contract. The policies were mentioned in the previous sentence and are therefore known information. The new information is that they shouldn't be presented as take them or leave them propositions, and indeed this gets explained a little further on in more detail. So in other words, by all means use the passive voice, but be sure that you have a good reason to use it. No new contract is a good reason to use the passive voice. Now, we saw an adverbial several minutes ago, and I said I would talk about it again. Now, this was the adverbial at the start of, well, it's the sentence, start of the paragraph, halfway down page 83. Despite the immense racial gulf separating them, Lincoln and Douglas had a lot in common. Now, that despite the immense racial gulf, etc., is an adverbial. Now, adverbials, you'll usually put an adverbial at the start of the sentence because you're trying to draw attention to that part of the sentence. So in other words, you're very consciously sometimes breaking the known new contract. The rest of the sentence is absolutely normal. The rest of the sentence reads something like Lincoln and Douglas had a lot in common. Now, that, despite the differences between them, could be harking back to information from a previous paragraph, or it could be harking forward to the differences that are going to be explained, particularly on the understanding that you're going to know that there's a difference between a tall, white lawyer from Illinois and a medium-sized freed black slave from, he was somewhere on the East Coast in the South, and ended up in New York and Boston, I believe. So you can and should, if you're trying to draw attention to the start of a sentence, use adverbials. Again, I'm at the bottom of page 95 here. Because a weasel is wild, it should be approached with great caution. Now, it isn't just an adverbial. In fact, it's an entire subclause. But hopefully you'll agree with me that the sentence would sound a little bit weaker if you said, a weasel should be approached with great caution because it's wild. Sounds a little flatter. So there are good reasons to use adverbials. Now, take a look at the sentence halfway down page 96. What you're doing here is you are inverting the subject and the predicate. Now, the subject usually comes first, right? John eats a banana. But in this case, the predicate is coming first. An important milestone. And it's only later in the sentence that we find out the demolition of 2 large dams in Washington is the important milestone. Now, like I say, when you're aware of the known new contract, you can occasionally break this rule. Now, it's entirely possible that this essay has been talking about milestones in the history of American ecology, and perhaps that's the reason that this sentence opens up with a reference to milestones. But there you are. Shaping up as an important milestone is the demolition of 2 large dams. And there's your new information there. The known information is that we're talking about milestones already in this essay, so it isn't new information. I very much like the group discussion exercise at the bottom of page 96. Why is the passive voice used in this passage? Now, you've been listening to my lecture. you should have some good ideas why there are several uses of the passive voice in that paragraph. Have a look at it and see if you can figure out why. Now, parallelism. Parallelism isn't just repeating the same words. It's repeating the same structure again and again. Let's take a look at I guess we can refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address. He said something like, "We are willing to," and then he followed it by the same phrase with a verb and a noun changed every time. Pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe. Now, although the verb changes and the noun changes, the structure is the same in each one of those phrases. That's parallelism. Now, the Portland passage on page 91 gets referred to again here at the bottom of page 97. Its eastern border is the deep, navigable Willamette River. Its western border is the steep West Hills. You can see how eastern border and western border are being paralleled there. Now, take a look at, lend your ears to the following passage, and particularly when economy is mentioned, country is mentioned, industry, and business. This is a rhetorically beautifully written paragraph. This is the one beginning at the very bottom of page 97. That knowledge has become the key resource means that there is a world economy, and that the world economy, rather than the national economy, is in control. Every country, every industry, and every business will be in an increasingly competitive environment. Every country, every industry, and every business will, in its decisions, have to consider its competitive standing in the world economy and the competitiveness of its knowledge competencies. Now, you do see that the same words are being repeated there, but they need not be. The important thing in the repetition is that the same structures are being repeated. The next passage, using antithesis, whereby opposites are provided, is an excellent example here. Several sentences pass with parallel structures being arranged next to each other. Why imagine that specific genes for aggression, dominance, or spite have any importance when we know that the brain's enormous flexibility permits us to be aggressive or peaceful, dominant or submissive, spiteful or generous? Violence, sexism, and general nastiness are biological, since they represent one subset of a possible range of behaviors. But peacefulness, equality, and kindness, you can see how that phrase is paralleling the previous triad, are just as biological, and we may see their influence increase if we can create social structures that permit them to flourish. This chapter ends with this repetition versus redundancy warning again. Know what repetition is and be careful. Know what redundancy is and be careful. But now that you know about these structural tools, now that you're conscious, at the very least you can break these rules every so often, if you so wish, knowing that you're breaking these rules. Otherwise, try to stick to them. Try to use parallel structures, try to use the no-new contract, etc. I'm very happy with the group discussion exercise that ends this chapter, and I recommend you do it by yourselves. So that's that. Hope you enjoyed that lecture, and I do hope to see you for our online lecture on Thursday. It isn't going to last 2.5 hours, don't worry. I don't know how much time it's going to last, but it'll have everything to do with the sort of questions that you ask in our online forum. So Hope things are working well at home, and see you soon.